sometimes it's better for me to just sit back, bite my tongue, and then in 4 years I'll be able to say what I want.
There has been a gradual institutionalization of this code of conduct, the effect of which is to prevent people from ventilating their views. Bright students won't put up with it.
Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith.
They stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber at Yale.
We disagree, we debate, and then at the end of the day, we remain friends.
Welcome everyone to Pod and Man at Yale. I'm your host, Audrey, Communications Director here at the Buckley Institute. Today, I'm joined by fellows with our Luxed Veritas Leadership Program. It's a 9-month program where students across the ideological spectrum learn the skills they'll need to lead a free society. I'm happy to welcome to the podcast Joe Gicante, a sophomore.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Audrey Bay, a sophomore.
Hi, thank you for having me.
And Constantine Semka, also a sophomore.
Hi, Ari. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you guys. What we're going to talk about today is whether liberal arts education matters. It's a perennial subject of debate. There are various state legislatures that have created new schools focused on liberal arts education at their state schools. But before we get into it, I want to ask, what does a liberal arts education mean in your mind? Constantine?
So first of all, I would like to start by saying that I come from Argentina. And I come from a very different tradition from that of liberal arts. In fact, much of the world doesn't follow the liberal arts philosophy. For example, Oxford has 3 years of intensive study of one subject. Argentina has 5 years of studying one subject. Unlike here in the US, where you have the opportunity to explore an interdisciplinary approach. I have the unique opportunity to be able to compare those different systems. Although I think it would be a bit unfair to compare liberal arts with the traditional university experience, since they pursue two different goals. I think that liberal arts is about learning how to think, learning how to learn. And the other college systems, what they're focused on is on acquiring knowledge. All of this to say that I think liberal arts is very important to us. Life is an interdisciplinary place, and we should study many things instead of focusing on one.
How about you, Audrey? What does liberal arts mean to you?
I think it's an education that seems more well-rounded. You have a lot of classes from various fields. And I also agree with what Constantine said about liberal arts being a space where one can learn rather than thinking about how to apply knowledge. And I think what this means for me is like a space where students have a lot more creativity and freedom to explore various ideas without having to ground it in some sort of practical application just yet. I think especially in the 4 years of college, it's meant to be, at least in my head, like a bubble away from the workforce. So I think liberal arts really contributes to this structure.
So one of the kind of criticisms, and I'll go to Joe for this one, is that it's kind of, as Audrey mentioned, it's not particularly practical. You're talking maybe your big ideas, philosophy. It doesn't get to anything in particular that could be useful. How do you know when you're in a liberal arts class?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess it's in the name, right? Like liberal, meaning that you choose what you want to do, and like different ways to pursue it. So I guess the way that you know you're in a liberal arts class is when like the teacher, the professor, the TA is asking more questions than they are just giving knowledge, right? So instead of sitting in a seat and listening to a lecturer talk at you for an hour and a half, you're getting to engage with ideas and develop your own way of thinking and really get deeper into the meaning of a lot of very important questions.
So you could be studying science, you could be studying computers, programming, engineering. Why is studying liberal arts something that's meaningful to you?
Like personally, I think it's very important to be an educated person, to have general knowledge of a lot of things and be able to approach problems and different systems in the world in a way that doesn't take things for granted, and looks at how you can interact with different systems, which is how I think a liberal art education functions. It asks you to interact with the course materials Instead of just like blindly following and absorbing knowledge, you're able to kind of have a dialectic with the material and with the course and with your teachers.
So Yale costs almost $100,000 a year, including room and board. When people think about that and you go like, well, you're sitting around learning, stuff that isn't practical, you're thinking about life. Why do you guys think that's worth the time that you're putting into it in your undergraduate education? Constantine?
Well, I'd like to mention that I think maybe that liberal education sets you back in the first couple years, but it really gives you an advantage later in life. Because what we learn in liberal education is how to think, how do we acquire knowledge in a faster, in a more efficient way. Being 18, you don't really know what you're going to do in life. And studying a very specific topic from a very young age entraps you on a certain path that maybe later in life you don't want to continue on. So I think that liberal education gives you that liberty. It gives you an advantage later in life when you really figure out what you want to do, when your mind is ordered, and then you can pursue it and be much more effective, learn faster, just all around be a better person.
So Audrey, we talked earlier, and you had mentioned in the group discussion, long before this interview, before the podcast, that you had been thinking about this, like, what do I want to do with my life for about a year or a year and a half already? You'd spent a lot of time focusing on this question, which I think a lot of people, even at Yale, a lot of students at Yale caught in the hustle and bustle of like getting things done, don't have time to think about. How do you think spending that time made you a better person or made your future trajectory better or, made your college education worthwhile?
Yeah, I think for me, I was in a really big dilemma because for my parents, they're first generation immigrants and they're spending a ridiculous amount of money to send me here. And back home, I received an insane amount of criticism from people at my church or people at my school and communities when I told them that I was looking to major in philosophy or something in the humanities, which I totally understand. I think it is a lot of money. But at the same, it's a lot of money. It is. But I think that if someone is going to spend that money to come to a school like Yale, they should really consider what they're going to do with the rest of their life, because maybe it is a huge upfront investment. But I really like what Constantine said, which is a lot of people at the midpoint of their career will realize this is not something that I feel fulfilled in, or so this is something that I really regret doing. And for me, I would much rather take the time now to seriously reflect on the kind of person that I want to be and the kind of life I want to lead, so that I can live my life with no regrets, even if in this initial process that seems to be very slow or inefficient.
So, Joe, I think you mentioned you're from a small town of like 1,000 people.
Very small.
So I imagine there's like kind of mixed emotions between like, you going from a town of 1,000 people to a place like Yale, and then you going from a town of 1,000 people to a place like Yale and studying liberal arts.
Right.
How do you balance those in your mind, and how do you, it's kind of what Audrey was talking about, like talk about those back at home.
So the funny thing about small towns, and especially extracurriculars in a small town, is that everybody kind of has to do everything, or there just won't be enough people to do it. So like I was a captain of the football team, but I also was like a lead actor through like a one-act play, and just a ton of random things that I really enjoyed. I feel like it helped me become like a well-rounded and more complete individual. And so going to a place like Yale hasn't been as jarring as I guess I'd expected at first, because Yale really like encourages students to do that same thing, like explore different avenues, get a broad base of knowledge. And so, yeah, like going back home, it's nice to be able to have conversations with people on topics that they maybe might not have thought of in a certain way. And that, through doing this broad education, I've been very fortunate to have those questions posed to me.
So I want to kind of go back and focus on something that Constantine mentioned. I'm going to start with Constantine and ask both Joe, and Audrey after. You talked about how the liberal arts education is like unique to America. in a certain sense.
Yes.
They don't do it in other countries.
Yes.
Do you think that gives America a competitive advantage?
I really do think that it does make American students different. Perhaps it is a disadvantage in the short term. Perhaps a Oxford graduate or someone that comes from Argentina doesn't have to do a master's degree just because they're better prepared. They know better the subject. And that comes from just spending more time on focusing your efforts instead of being a jack of all trades, a master of none. But I think that liberal arts gives you a very strong foundation on which you can build later your career. And what many people from other countries lack is that strong foundation. When later they want to pursue other stuff in life, either they don't really know what they want to do, and because their mind is not ordered, they were thrust into this life of being a professional, of pursuing your career really early on when they shouldn't have. And people in the US know a little bit more about what they want to do. And since they're more passionate about what they do, they're able to be more successful in whatever field they ultimately decide to stay in.
How about you, Joe?
Yeah.
Why do you think America is better?
Of course. Of course. It's really interesting. There's something very unique about America when we look back at like the past 2 centuries. America's really been this kind of bastion of innovation and creativity. And I think that the liberal arts education is a contributor to that. And maybe it's not the sole reason. Maybe it's a symptom of like, this American like idea of liberalism and freedom. But yes, going back to like the innovation point, it's difficult to teach somebody to be creative. That's not something you can learn in a classroom, right? There's no creativity 101. That has to come from learning how to think and thinking through different systems, which is what a liberal arts education really is.
So at Yale, and I kind of mentioned other schools are starting this up, but Yale in particular has a very strong program called Directed Studies, where you spend the first year literally reading all the classics. And not only is it great for cocktail banter later on in life, the thought is also it gives you that opportunity to think about those deep ideas. There was a report, I think, last fall that had a record number of applicants. They turned away a record number of people. Do you think programs like this are worthwhile? And why do you think Directed Studies in particular has become so popular?
Yeah, I can speak to at least the popularity of Directed Studies since I did the program last year. And I had actually considered dropping, and I had also considered not applying in the first place. So my opinion on it has dramatically shifted over my first year at Yale. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that Directed Studies, it's a very stressful program, especially for a first year that's transitioning into Yale. But the reason why it's so excellent is, especially in America, I think there is almost this erasure of classical civilizations and education on these fundamental texts. And the great part of this program is that it is very overwhelming to have to read like 60 texts each semester across literature, history.
60?
Yeah, 60 total. I counted.
That's like 5 or 6 books.
Yeah. It's crazy. One of our weeks, like we had to read 500 pages like across our classes on top of having a paper. But digression aside, I think that the reason it's so popular now is I think people are starting to realize, the classics are so important and we're really erasing that in the US, or we're having very radical modern interpretations that are not really true to text. I think the second thing is that it allows you to recognize these connections across various fields and apply them into practical solutions or policy for today. And I think that a lot of history repeats itself. We see this in culture and art, and a very in-depth study of it, I think, is appealing to a lot of Yale students who wish to make a genuine impact on the world that is sustainable and models off of their predecessors.
Yeah, I guess I can comment on this looking from the other perspective. I didn't do Directed Studies, and now after the fact, I wish that I had. I had a lot of friends that were stressed out over how many books they had, but the knowledge that they seem to have gained from it is something that is really hard to replicate through even, different semesters of Yale. But yeah, the study of the classics, I think it represents like a broader shift towards conservatism that you can kind of track across America and really the world right now. And there's a reason that these classics, the books that directed studies, they're classics for a reason, right? There's some story in there. There's some truth that like transcends time, and generations of people before you have found the same message. And with like revisionist history, I think people really hunger for things that tell them like, yes, our systems are in place for a reason. And there's messages that resonate across times, cultures, and generations.
It's gonna go to the next step, like the money question, beyond not the money you're putting in, but the money you're getting out of it, right? You do have to get jobs, you're gonna graduate eventually. How do you guys see the study of the classics, doing DS, or focusing on philosophy paying off in the long run?
I think, obviously I'm not an employer, but I heard from my coaches, both in high school and here at Yale, that they would rather have an athlete who maybe has middling skills but is coachable more than one who thinks that they know everything, and is unable to learn new ways to do things. And I think that's like the essence of what the education and the grounding in classics and the liberal arts education we get at Yale is teaching us. It's teaching us how to be coachable, how to think about different systems, how to place ourselves into them, and ultimately how to function within those and improve them, which is obviously useful in the workplace. I mean, you can learn anything. Or
yeah, I agree. Like, I think it makes someone a lot more flexible towards learning new skills and I guess being open to a variety of fields that maybe otherwise weren't appealing to them. For example, like there's plenty of like the CEO of Palantir, like the person who is like really running all of this, he has a PhD in philosophy. Steve Jobs, like the reason why Apple was so big was because of the typography and the visual design of the product, which he really wouldn't have gotten if he didn't take a calligraphy course like when he went to Reed. So I don't know, there's just like some standoff examples, but I think that when it comes to the debate over practicality overall, I mean, a Yale education, that $100,000 price tag does not just include like, the education that you're getting. It's also it's also accounting for different opportunities, like the network and access to that. So I think that's one side note I would say. But I think the second thing is when you have this interest in liberal arts and you want to find ways in which you can better position yourself to lead a society, I think you have to account for the past. And that's just not something that I think is as present in a purely STEM education or something that is like grounded in pure practicality.
So Constantine, you're at your first job interview after you graduated, and the interviewer says like, well, you spent a lot of time studying liberal arts. Why should that matter to me? What's your answer?
So I talked with many alumni, young and old, and I think there's one thing that they all coincide on, that is that you can learn everything you need at the job. What matters most is your ability to learn, to acquire knowledge. It's not the knowledge itself. And I think that is what Yale teaches you. Any kid at Yale is really smart, or for that at any other college. So they have the ability to learn. What matters, there's very few professions that you really have to have a prior knowledge. For example, medicine or being a lawyer. But that is the reason why then you have to further your education either in law school or in medical school. The vast array of professions don't require you to have that prior knowledge. What they require you is to have discipline, to have order, to be a good person, someone you want to work with, and to be able to learn fast. Those are the skills that you really need, and those are the skills you acquire at a place like Yale.
So I'm going to throw you guys a bit of a curveball here. You guys have been reading Plato or talking about Plato for the past 2 days. You had to read it in preparation of all this. We were obviously coming right off with the U.S. Literally, I don't know if it's kidnapping, capturing Maduro, the head of Venezuela, taking him back to New York for trial. What is teaching Plato or reading Plato, rather discussing Plato, teach us about like how to think about Maduro, Venezuela, and America?
I mean, the Greeks influenced everybody in the West. So I think one way you can look at it is that the modern political thought is very much informed by the way that the Greeks saw America's republic is formed on like Athenian ideas and all of this. So then I think one way is people we read in history also read Plato. I think that our conception of justice, our conception of what a democracy ought to look like, and a lot of the justifications that were thrown out, besides like, oh, there's oil in Venezuela, there's also justifications that people are making about, Venezuela was a dictatorship. There was a lot of human rights infringements that were happening right now. Was it part of the U.S.'s duty in establishing justice and being a bastion of democracy to when they see injustice being committed, is it right for them to like go in and kidnap Maduro? Like all of these kinds of questions were things that had already been previously conceptualized by Plato and by other like Greek forefathers. And I think that it's very vital that because they've brought up these questions like 2,000 years ago, and these are like people who have spent all of their lives like contemplating these questions, why not just read that book that they spent their whole life thinking about in like 3 or 4 hours and derive those kinds of answers from there? And I think that's just the value of reading classics. Like all these people dedicated their whole lives, they die for this, and we get to just read it in like 6 or 7 hours, and then we're able to discuss it with people.
So how about you, Constantine? Plato and Venezuela.
So what really struck me about reading Plato is how many of the things that were written centuries and centuries ago can be applied to the modern day. Maybe the institution changed, countries changed, borders changed, but humans didn't. We have still the same desires, still the same questions. We are still humans. And whatever your opinion is on what happened in Venezuela, what Plato really teaches you, again, this is the idea I've been circling about this whole podcast, but that is learning how to think. I think Plato shows you a way to be logical and to also add other elements like your feelings into your thought process, and to put all of that into a machine, put all your assumptions into this black box and come out with a decision, an opinion that will guide your life. And I think this could be applied to Venezuela. I think, as Audrey said, a lot of our institutions are built on what the Romans, what the Greeks did. And understanding the Greek philosophy, the way the Greeks thought about life, is a way to also understand our modern life, and to and that helps you to form an opinion on what's happening in current events.
So Joe, I'll give you the last word on this. What does Plato teach us about Venezuela?
Yeah. To get a little bit more specific, I guess the Plato we're reading, in it, Socrates, who is very much an idealist, debates somebody somewhat in passing on the subject of whether we should be more practical in our political pursuits, or if we should stick to our ideals, such as justice and, for Americans, like liberalism and freedom. So I think you can apply that very easily. Like sometimes government has to be a very practical pursuit, but if we as Americans, hold these certain values very dearly, we should be idealist in some sense. And so it's America's duty to stick to our ideals. And, if there's a dictator killing people and imprisoning and torturing them, that's not something that jives with our ideals. So we should step in.
All right. Well, Audrey, Constantine, Joe, thanks so much for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
And now on to our interview with AEI's Dr. Ben Storey on the liberal arts and the future of American higher education. I'd like to welcome Dr. Ben Storey to Pod and Man at Yale. Dr. Storey is the American Enterprise Institute Senior Fellow and Ravenel Curry Chair in Civic Thought and co-director of AEI's Center for the Future of the American University. He's concurrently an SNF Agora Fellow at Johns Hopkins University and a research fellow at the Civitas Institute at the University of Texas in Austin. He's a published author, is currently working on a book with his wife, Jenna Silber Storey, who's also a friend of the Buckley Institute, titled The Art of Choosing: How Liberal Education Should Prepare You for Life. I could go on and on, still wouldn't do Dr. Storey justice. He's a fantastic person, a fantastic educator. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you, Ari. I always love my engagements with the Buckley program and with Yale students.
And our students love it also. He leads and we'll get into a little bit later. He does the first retreat for our 9-month Lux at Veritas leadership program. They discuss Plato, things that, I tried once and it never clicked with me, but he finds a way to make it interesting and engaging, and the students love it. But that kind of leads us to our first question. And when I talked to the students for this panel, for this episode also, is about liberal arts. It's something that comes up, in the 4 years we've been doing this, it comes up. Why are liberal arts important? Why should people study it?
I think that's a really timely question, Ari, because I think the disaffection from the liberal arts is at a kind of high watermark in our moment. And I think to push back a little bit against that disaffection, I think it's useful to remember that the term liberal arts was actually first coined by Cicero, a Roman author, not a Greek author. I love the Greeks, but it's important to emphasize here that Cicero was a Roman. And Cicero celebrated the liberal arts as preparation for public life, for life in the arena, for being able to gather together the energies of a powerful republic like Rome and direct them by means of one's speech. He thought that that's what the liberal arts could teach you to do. And so in this sense, I think it's worth remembering in our, I think what part of the decline of the liberal arts in our time is that it seems too much maybe it's preparation for academic life, maybe it's preparation for nothing at all. It's just the royal road to being a barista. It's worth remembering that's not why the liberal arts ensconced themselves as a 2,000-year tradition in the West. They were thought of as essential preparation for political life, for life that is going to have a really significant impact. And I think that's, for that reason, America has been dedicated to the liberal arts in our Republican system of government since the very beginning, and in a certain sense, since before the beginning. That's something that I think is not accidental. I think it goes together with our Republican character in ways that we can talk about.
So that's actually was going to be my next question. There's so much we could talk about the liberal arts, but you and I have a bunch to cover. So this is going to be, the only other question I have on it. But in the panel, one of the students mentioned, he is not from the United States, and he mentioned that liberal arts is something that's almost unique to the United States, or, very heavily emphasized here and not in other countries, especially as higher education goes. So to your point, what happens to a country when its people don't study liberal arts? What does their society miss?
I think that's a nice way to put the question. Let me tell a quick story in response to this. I interviewed a few years ago a man named John Agresto, and John had been the president of St. John's College, a wonderful liberal arts college, with a really serious liberal arts curriculum out in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then he had led the American University in Iraq at Soleimani. And, of course, the Iraq intervention is controversial and so on and so forth. And, lots of people have doubts about that, but I don't think that's particularly relevant to the remark that I'm going to highlight of John's that was really significant. So one of the things that John learned as an administrator at the American University of Iraq at Soleimani was that in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, there were plenty of people studying things like engineering, dentistry, medicine, so on and so forth. All that stuff, that was fun, uncontroversial. You can do that in a dictatorship. You can do that in a republic. You can do that anywhere. When John started promoting the study of history, study of literature, study of philosophy, that had explosive potential. And that's how the former regime saw it. And that's what was so electrifying to his students in this kind of context. And so there, it came out to him in a particularly poignant way that the liberal arts and Republican self-government were really closely connected. And I think that's something that people have intuited in our system for a long time. And so let me give you one further example of this. America has been in the liberal arts business since before it was America. That is, Harvard was founded in 1636 when the Puritans were only 16 years on this continent. That is, they founded a college in time to educate the first generation of children born to them here. And if you think of our subsequent political creations, all of them depend on the kind of learning that goes on in a liberal arts college. And so if you look at the Declaration of Independence and particularly the Constitution, one thing you'll notice about the Constitution is that it's a highly non-intuitive form of government. That is, if you just say the word democracy, this is not what you would come up with. It's a kind of Rube Goldberg project with all kinds of complexities and these kinds of things. Why do we have this complex and strange system of government? We have it because the people who designed it were deeply versed in history and philosophy, were deeply aware of the fact that governing oneself is difficult, right? And it requires all kinds of remarkable inventions of the human mind to do well. Governing ourselves is, human projects to govern ourselves, they've often failed. And much of the learning that informs our own projects of self-government is reflection on those kinds of failures. Without the liberal arts, any kind of appreciation of the kind of government that we have is really quite hopeless because people just follow the mind's natural demand for simplicity. Well, it turns out that actually governing yourself freely might require some complexity. And sometimes it requires some education to appreciate that.
So again, like I could talk about that with you the whole podcast, but we've got a bunch of other things to cover. So I'm going to move to the campus now. Buckley Institute, we recently released our 2025 Faculty Political Diversity Study. We found that at Yale, there's a 36-to-1 ratio of Democrats to Republicans. In the undergrad, law school, School of Management, of the 43 undergrad departments that we reviewed, 27 had 0 Republicans at all among the faculty, including in departments like classics and American studies. Does this kind of imbalance matter? Does it matter to the students? Does it matter to the university? Does it matter to the American public?
Yes, it matters a great deal. It's funny, Ari, when you mentioned some of these, numbers. I've been talking about these numbers for a long time, and I used to, sort of check very carefully, and then I'd say 8-to-1, and then I'd say 10-to-1, and now you guys, there's some of the subsets of your survey. I think what was it in the humanities, 72-to-1?
Yeah, it was brutal. Yeah, it was really bad.
It's so it's getting to the point that it is hard to exaggerate. And that matters for a lot of reasons. One is the one that is most talked about. So the viewpoint diversity problem with this, the one that gets the most talked about is the competing hypotheses problem. That is, when you're trying to understand something, if you don't have people who entertain and really believe in different competing hypotheses, different ways of explaining a social phenomena, for example, if you don't have people really advocating for those things, you don't test it out well enough. That's the most common argument that gets made about viewpoint diversity. But there are a lot of other, and I'll mention 3. One is the competing claims hypothesis, which is a little different from the viewpoint, the rival hypotheses problem. Competing claims refers to this: some problems of human life or some questions are not questions that we're ever going to solve by means of coming up with a hypothesis and proving it scientifically or something like this. I mean, the question of the nature of justice, the question of the character of God, the question of the nature of beauty. People tend to see these things have preoccupied human beings for a very long time, and human beings have never come to any widely shared agreement on a lot of these kinds of questions. And so there are enduring contests of competing claims. Say, for example, the claim that justice is on the one hand equality, which it is in many different cases, but justice is also sometimes inequality. As, for example, if you're grading a set of papers, you don't want to give different work, different qualities of work the same grade. So justice is sometimes equality, justice is sometimes inequality. Those are competing claims about justice, both of which are somehow kind of true. Those competing claims often map on to our political divisions. People tend to be sympathetic toward one side or the other of the competing claims that we make about God or the beautiful or the just. And we need to have those arguments on campus to keep things philosophically robust. 2 more quick points about this. One is mentorship. It's good for conservative students to have conservative mentors on faculty so as to guide, so that they can see that being a conservative and living an intellectual life are things that can actually be in continuity with each other, that can actually be in harmony with each other, and so they don't just become so alienated from the academy as we see so often right now. And thirdly is the political question. Universities, even so-called private universities, receive about on average 25% of their funding from public sources, from federal sources, actually. When you're subsidized to that degree by the public, and the public is, as it is in the United States, closely divided along political lines, it's really just a profound injustice to ask a deeply divided country to support an almost totally partisan enterprise, which is what too much of higher education has become. So universities will be intrinsically better in the research they do, in the teaching they do. They'll be better for their students in terms of the mentorship opportunities, and they'll be better off politically if they do not simply say things like, there's nothing we can do about it. Those kinds of viewpoint diversity problems. There are things they can do about it, and there are lots of intelligent people working on this.
To your point, I think the public aspect has definitely been underappreciated. I think the public outcry over this has gotten significant in the past 10 years, but on our report, Elon Musk tweeted it out. We had a lot of wide coverage. Ron DeSantis commented on it. I think the public in general is has been frustrated for a while, and maybe it's boiling over. But, we think about Yale put together a committee on trust in higher education with 10 faculty members. 7 were Democrats, 2 were independent, and 1 was a non-U.S. citizen. And then, they asked, how do you ask a group like that with no ideological diversity, to solve that trust issue?
It's a really serious problem. And, what we've seen from some other institutions around the country is that, look, even if at a place like your alma mater, Johns Hopkins, a professor like Steve Tellez can say, I don't know any Republicans, out of the closet Republicans in the humanities and the social sciences at my institution at Johns Hopkins. Steve has written this. Even if Steve can, if Steve looks at Johns Hopkins and he sees something like this, he says something like this, what you can say for that institution and its leadership is they recognize the problem and they're trying to attend to it. And that's part of one of the projects that we've been working on here at AEI, which is a series of collaborative initiatives with JHU, because we're just really heartened to have some people on the inside of the academy who are really interested in working on these things.
So I definitely do want to drill down on the Johns Hopkins initiative and the work you're doing at AEI. But I think before we can talk about what can be done, maybe I want to ask how we got here.
There are probably lots of causal forces at work. In some cases, you may have outright discrimination. I certainly don't think that faculty hiring committees are always perfectly fair. But I don't know that I think actually the heart of the issue is in some ways deeper. So a young scholar at Ohio State University named Jesse Smith published a couple of papers on the website of our center at AEI, the Center for the Future of the American University. One was called Paradigmatic Progressivism, and the other was called Toward a Conservative Social Science. What Jesse points out in these papers is that progressivism is in some ways baked into the foundations of a discipline like his own, sociology. Sociologists just very widely assume that the kinds of questions that progressives care about, for example, racial disparities with respect to policing, these kinds of questions are worthy of investigation. And I'm not saying that those kinds of questions aren't worthy of investigation. They are worthy of investigation. But there might be other questions that are worthy of investigation, such as, to use an example that Jesse gives, the socially formative effects of military service. That's the kind of question that a conservative would be more interested in. But the structure, the overwhelming homogeneity of a discipline such as sociology makes it the case that the kinds of questions that progressives care about just get investigated again and again and again. And when job candidates come up, the people who are doing the hiring just assume, right, this is a legitimate area to study, and that is not a legitimate area to study, because that's what everybody in their field is saying. And so it can be the case that on any particular research project, a progressive social scientist is doing perfectly honest social scientific research. They can be doing their regression analyses, very well. They can be doing, objective work, often within a progressive paradigm. And at the same time be true that the entire field is closing its eyes to whole areas of study that could be really fruitful. And that's what Jesse is pointing to when he points to a conservative social science. He's not asking for a social science that confirms conservatives and stuff they already thought. He's asking for a social science that asks the kinds of questions that conservatives are interested in, which would allow us to understand our social world much better.
Does that, in his interpretation or his understanding and yours, translate into who gets those jobs, or which, I guess, research is green-lighted, or everything in between?
I've never been an advocate of what some people call affirmative action for conservatives. I certainly am not an advocate of looking up people's voter registrations in the job application process. And so all of this is rather rough. But it happens to be the case that there's a significant correlation between people's politics and the kinds of things they study. Everybody knows this on campus. Nobody has any doubt that you can guess, if you guess the politics of a military historian on the one hand and a gender historian on the other, you might be wrong if you think the gender historian is on the left and the military historian is on the right. But, in general, the correlations are going to work out over the long run, in roughly that kind of direction. And so it has been the case that the Academy has systematically shrunk those subfields of any kind of major field of study. Those subfields that code as conservative have been systematically eliminated or vastly diminished over the course of the last 50 years. And you can reverse that process, again, not by looking up anybody's voter registration during the hiring process, but just by hiring in the areas that this neglected group tends to want to work. And so there's a great story about from James Hankins in Compact magazine about the drift of the Harvard history department that eventually caused Professor Hankins to leave and move down to the University of Florida. That drift is not an automatic process. That's the kind of thing that people can intervene in and change.
How, you touched just a second ago on what kind of things that can be changed or fix the imbalance in the university. We talk a little bit about what you're doing at AEI, what you're doing at AEI with Johns Hopkins, and how that fits into your goals to fix the modern university.
Yeah, fix the modern university is rather grandiose, the way of putting it. But we'd certainly like to help.
Move one university, move slightly in the right direction.
But Johns Hopkins, this is an initiative that my wife Jenna has led and worked really closely with Johns Hopkins President Ron Daniels and Phil Spector, who's in Ron Daniels' office, to create, along with a group of Johns Hopkins faculty and administrators who have been really great on these things. The cooperative work that's going on between AEI and Johns Hopkins has a number of different elements. One thing, we have a fellowship exchange program that is designed to create collaborative teaching and research projects between people on the faculty at Johns Hopkins and scholars at AEI. So to give you one example of that, next week I'm going to start teaching a course with the chair of the political science department at Hopkins, Ravi Shilliam, on liberal education, a contested question. Ravi and I are very different people. We come at these things from very different perspectives. Ravi describes himself as a post-colonialist. And I'm a fellow at a center-right think tank. And so we're not cut from the same cloth. But he's a wonderful person, and we share some intellectual things that are perhaps deeper than politics. And so we're going to have a really good time teaching this class together with a set of really divergent readings, the kinds of things that you wouldn't often find on the same reading list. And so I hope that'll be a really good opportunity for the students. We've got a whole series of collaborative efforts like that between AEI people and Hopkins scholars.
So I think a lot of the momentum around change on university campuses, a lot of it traces back to October 7th and the response on campus. But then there's definitely been a surge during the Trump administration. He's put a lot of energy and effort into cracking down on universities for this bias, for what's going on campus. Regardless of which one plays a bigger factor in how you feel about the Trump administration, how you feel about October 7th, are you optimistic about the prospects for reform of higher ed, for fixing these underlying dynamics that are the source of the conflict?
I have seen more movement on these kinds of issues in the last 18 months than I've ever seen in my adult lifetime. And I've heard from many others who have long been in the midst of university work and are deeply familiar with this history, who are at a kind of consensus in regarding this as a watershed moment, a moment that I think will come to be remembered as a turning point, not so different from, say, 1876, when Hopkins was founded in the beginning of the research university, or 1950 with the publication of Vannevar Bush's Science, the Endless Frontier, which really codified the social contract between our federal government and the scientific research projects that go on our college and university campuses. This is a big, big turning point. And yeah, I see lots of positive momentum. I've talked to a lot of college and university administrators who have recognized that there's a big problem in terms of things like viewpoint diversity, or the absence of viewpoint diversity, and the rise of anti-Semitism on campus. They've known about these things for a long time. They have found it difficult to do anything about them in the ordinary constellation of forces that prevails on a university campus. And what has happened in this second Trump administration is a big new force has appeared on that landscape that actually in some ways has made it possible for people to make progress in ways that they wouldn't have been able, what they regard as progress, in ways that they wouldn't have been able to make progress before. I think that's ultimately going to be for the good of these institutions. Now, that's not to say that, look, I think the Trump administration has gone too far. In certain cases, there are some of the measures that they laid out that I don't think were well thought through or well designed. And I think there could be a lot of damage done, and I'm worried about the kind of damage that can be done by populist overreach with respect to the university. Nonetheless, some of these problems are really deeply entrenched, and they, in my view at least, people have been sort of asking universities to change on these fronts in very nice, polite ways, and so on and so forth for a long time. Since your namesake, William F. Buckley, pointed out this problem in 1951, I think it was, with God and Man at Yale. And the polite brush off has been the basic response of colleges and universities to their conservative critics for a very long time. Well, you have to hand it to the Trump administration. They've actually gotten beyond the polite brush off. That doesn't mean I endorse everything they're doing. But nonetheless, I think there's real progress being made, and I hope a lot of that progress can be entrenched before we see the next shift in the political winds, which will inevitably come. The reason I want to see that entrenched, I'm a conservative, but it's not because I'm a conservative. It's because I think universities will be better if they respond to some of these kinds of concerns.
And so I want to wrap up with the last question. So with the caveats about how you feel about the specific policies of the Trump administration regarding universities, Trump leaves in 2029. For the sake of the question, assume he's replaced by a Democrat. Do universities keep trying to fix themselves, or do they kind of go back to business as usual?
No, that's going to be a moment where that reveals some things, isn't it? I mean, look, there are some people there are some universities that are working on this because I think they see the truth in the critiques to which they've been subjected, and they are dedicated to working on that, and they're going to try to hold on to the changes that they've made, maybe even go further with them. Some people won't. Some people will shift back with the political wind. Won't surprise me. And it's worth noting, particularly to a Buckley audience, which contains some young conservatives who might be really excited about what some of what they've seen from the Trump administration. This is a war this is a cycle of escalation that we're watching in terms of how political actors are dealing with the university. New means are coming onto the field. With every change of who's in political power, whether at the federal level or at the state level. And, people on the right should remember that the new means that Trump has effectively legitimated by using them with respect to the universities, well, they're probably going to be used in the other direction. And so we should remember that and not get too excited. Nonetheless, progress is taking place. I'm glad for the progress. I hope the progress will be deeply entrenched before the political winds change, and I hope that actually a lot of people will see that universities are better.
Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for joining us on Pod and Man at Yale.
All right, thanks very much, Harry. I always love to talk with you and talk with all the people associated with the Buckley program.
There's another great episode of Pod and Man at Yale with our Lux at Veritas Leadership Fellows and past guest, Dr. Ben and Storey from AEI. And always remember, for God, for country, and for Yale in that order.